Hello. This lecture will examine the early republic from 1789 to 1825. This was a great period in U.S. history as the young American republic emerged from the American Revolutionary War in the tumultuous times of the Articles of Confederation. During this first 30 some odd years of U.S. history, the U.S. Supreme Court would take shape. The United States of America would engage Great Britain in yet another conflict that would finally and officially declare its independence from European interference. And a young Republican society finally took shape. This lecture will examine four main objectives. The first is to identify key people and events. Second, to examine the evolution of early American social and political issues. 3, to understand the foreign relations between the U.S., Britain, and France. And finally, our fourth objective is to trace the expansion of the United States into Western lands. It all began with the Washington administration that lasted from 1790 to 1797. Following the ratification of the United States Constitution, the former General George Washington faced pretty much an undisputed election. This would be really the only time in U.S. history that such an event would occur. Most people were more than willing to go along with Washington's leadership because this was the same beloved general that had led the United States forces through times of hardship and doubt to their destiny of American independence. When Washington came into power, he really only had 3 secretaries. This is quite different from today, when there are multiple secretary offices to support our administrations, whereas our current presidents have secretaries of the Interior, War, secretaries of the Treasury, Homeland Security, and Transportation. George Washington only had 3. There was the Secretary of the War, Henry Knox, a reliable individual that had served as Washington's chief general over his artillery forces during the American Revolutionary War. The second was Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, a self-made individual from the Caribbean that had established himself squarely in New York City's elite society, a framer of the U.S. Constitution, and one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, whose successful arguments carried the debate over ratification. And finally, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, acclaimed author of the American Declaration of Independence, former ambassador to the French court, as well as the governor of Virginia. Of the 3 secretaries, though, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson would have the longest lasting influences. First, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton was an individual who believed in a strong central government. Having experienced the hardships of the American Revolutionary War and the difficulties of getting the Continental Congress to appropriate funds for supplies, as well as its continued difficulties in just providing leadership for the American nation during the first 4 years of its existence, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton advocated a strong government, federal government, that would support manufacturing and general economic policy in the United States. From 1790 to 1791, he authored 3 reports that outlined his vision for a future American economy: the Report on Public Credit, Report on the National Bank, and Report on Manufacturers advocated a number of crucial policies. Among them was a desire for the federal government to assume all outstanding state debts, as well as other debts that were accrued as a result of the American Revolutionary War. By doing so, Alexander Hamilton argued, the United States of America would be in a strong fiscal policy, as well as a strong economic policy when engaging in negotiations, especially in terms of trade with other nations. His report on a national bank advocated the creation of a central financial institution that would assist in fiscal policies, oversee monetary policy, and finally would provide a place where the United States government could store its funds and could use those funds through loans to support farming and manufacturing. Finally, he advocated in Report on Manufacturers that the federal government should support efforts at creating an industrial base in the United States. While he recognized that agriculture would continue to play a crucial role in the economy for the foreseeable future, he also saw the writing on the wall. In Great Britain at this time period, the Industrial Revolution was finally starting to take shape. Machines of enterprise and industry were being created, especially in the nascent textile industry. And Alexander Hamilton rightly identified this as the future to not only strong state economics, but also a strong state government that would be able to support its military, support its industry, as well as to support the necessary infrastructure that states would need to compete in a more global economy. In order to achieve this, Alexander Hamilton relied mostly on the necessary and proper clause. Most of his ideas were not explicitly spelt out in the Constitution, but he believed that this clause could be used because these types of actions would support the general well-being of the general welfare of the nation, as well as to also help provide for a stronger defense through generating funds that would be able to support a stronger military. Alexander Hamilton's policies had no end of detractors. A number of the framers of the Constitution, including James Madison, as well as those that did not necessarily help create the Constitution but played a pivotal role in American independence, individuals such as Thomas Jefferson saw this as an overreach on the part of the central government. It was too much government, and it threatened to lead the United States of America down the road of tyranny, down the road of centralized power that they had sought to escape from Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War. Nonetheless, Alexander Hamilton did find supporters, and his supporters over time would eventually coalesce into the Federalist Party. His ideas also gave an ideological foundation for what was known as loose constructionism, or interpreting the Constitution in less strict terms to allow the federal government more leeway in its policies. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, advocated a different path for the United States of America. While he accepted the federal government in the form that the United States Constitution created, he was very wary of too much overreach. Jefferson's ideology called for defenses against a moneyed aristocracy. To him, the greatest threat to liberty was too much wealth accumulating in the hands of a small group of individuals. Through their wealth, they would gain too much power and too much influence, and the result would be no different than what the ancient Roman Senate and Republic experienced as individuals such as Julius Caesar vied for power and eventually overthrew the Senate. To him, this was the first line of defense for liberty. As such, Thomas Jefferson himself even advocated creating an estate tax, whereby individuals of great wealth would lose most of their holdings, most of their wealth on their death through these taxes. As such, this would prevent their children from accumulating too great an amount of money and therefore being able to weaken the pillars of liberty within the United States of America. For Jefferson, cities did play a role. Manufacturing did play a role. However, he viewed cities as basically cesspools, places of vice, places of corruption. While countries needed them for the marketing of goods and services, as well as for the manufacturing of items that people relied on, his greatest belief was in an agrarian society where individuals would establish free farms, where they would advance their lives through the labors of their own hands, and where this would create the necessary virtues for a republican society. Of course, one can see the irony in Jefferson's ideology. He himself was a great landowner. He would leave great wealth to his heirs, and he himself was a slave owner. As such, he did not necessarily earn his living through the sweat of his own brows and hard work through his own hands. Instead, he relied on individuals stripped of their humanity and stripped of their freedom to toil in the fields, as he himself led a more leisurely lifestyle. Regardless, his ideas did carry weight in the fledgling republic, and promoters of his idea, of his ideology, through the next decade would coalesce into the Democratic Republican Party. Through much of Washington's administration, his attention was really fixated on two things. Number one, getting this fledgling nation up and running. He faced the biggest challenge. While the Dutch did have a republic, the United States of America didn't really have a working model to look towards in terms of how to run this government. They themselves were engaging in a great experiment. How should government function? What should their policies be? Should he follow the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and really focus on a strong centralized government? Or should he take the advice of Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and rely more on an agrarian society? Over time, George Washington would choose the former. We oftentimes view Washington as the quote-unquote captive Federalist. After all, Alexander Hamilton was his trusted aide-de-camp during the American Revolutionary War, and so his voice tended to carry a little greater weight in the administration than Thomas Jefferson's did. As such, Washington, in the long run, would end up adopting a number of Alexander Hamilton's policies, including taxes to raise revenue to deal with the debts that were outstanding from the American Revolutionary War, as well as other needs that the young republic found itself facing. The end result was an attempted rebellion against Washington's administration. One of the policies that Alexander Hamilton proposed and that was later passed by Congress was an excise tax on whiskey. Now, at first, it seemed like this would be a relatively innocuous tax, something that would not generate a lot of opposition within American society. However, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington failed to realize that whiskey had become a type of currency in the backwoods of the United States of America. Grain products were oftentimes too bulky, too heavy, and too expensive to transport from frontier settlements to the markets. As a result, many farmers preferred instead to transform their grains into distilled spirits, and therefore be able to deliver those more easily with the higher profit margin to the market. So this excise tax tended to hit poorer and middle-class farmers heavier than it did the eastern cities. As a result, in western Pennsylvania, a series of protests started in 1794 where farmers started advocating outright refusal to help tax gatherers gather these funds. And at the height of the Whiskey Rebellion, there was actually talk of outright armed insurrection. Washington responded quickly. He mobilized both militiamen as well as the army, totaling a number of 13,000 troops, and threatened to march them on the western settlements. It quickly silenced them and reminded them that this was a new era. No longer would a Continental Congress fumble about in the eastern states. Instead, they now faced a unified, centralized government that could actually project its power throughout the countryside. Now, while Washington did enjoy large amounts of popularity throughout his administration, towards the end, some of his policies were gaining him critics. In 1796, George Washington faced the possibility of having to run yet again for office, and facing another 4 years afterwards of dealing with these headaches. He opted instead for permanent retirement. He announced to the nation in his farewell address of 1796 that he would not be seeking the office of the president for a third term, and in doing so established a tradition in the United States of America where presidents would be limited to only 2 terms in office. The only president to really go beyond this was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. However, an amendment to the United States Constitution quickly followed his administration, and today the United States presidency is limited to 2 terms. Now, in the farewell address of 1796, Washington made 3 main appeals. The first was to national unity. He believed that they could not fall into the squabbling and petty disputes that had characterized this region during the period of British North America, as well as during the early years under the Articles of Confederation. They needed to be one country, unified by a central government. In addition to that, Washington argued against the formation of political parties. Like many of his time period, it was believed that political parties corrupted republics, that in coming together in official political parties, money and self-interest would end up dominating government instead of the general welfare of the country as a whole. Finally, he encouraged his fellow citizens to avoid any entangling alliances with other countries. The other crucial challenge that Washington had faced throughout his administration was the French Revolution and the conflict between Great Britain and the French Empire. Too often, it threatened to pull the United States of America into the wider conflict, and the United States of America, Washington realized, was not prepared for such a war. The French believed that the United States of America should support their efforts. After all, they were the ones that came to America's aid during the war. Great Britain, on the other hand, was the major maritime power, and it was still the major trading partner of the United States of America. So it was through these experiences of having to thread this very fine needle, this very fine path, that Washington realized that the United States of America, at this crucial point in its history, had to stay out of these broader conflicts. Now, the election of 1796 was a period of uncertainty. Americans hadn't really gone through a true presidential election yet. Now, they did have experience electing members of their houses of burghers when they were colonies. They had continued experiences with elections in their state governments. But this was the real first true national election for the executive office within the United States of America. Now, the election in 1796 pitted two different visions of the United States of America against each other. There was John Adams and his running mate, Thomas Pinckney, and they embodied the Hamiltonian view of the United States and the course that it should plot, one of a looser interpretation of the federal government, one that called for the federal government to support manufacturing internal improvements, what we call today infrastructure, as well as the creation of institutions like a national bank. Also, John Adams tended to lean more towards the British in their conflict with the French. John Adams viewed the United States of America as the offspring of the British Empire, after all. And he also recognized that the United States of America had a closer link in terms of trade than they did with the French Empire. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr embraced Jefferson's ideology of an agrarian society. They distrusted institutions such as national banks. And Thomas Jefferson, having been the ambassador to France during the early phases of the French Revolution, still felt great sympathy for that movement that had begun there. In fact, it is widely believed that Thomas Jefferson helped to actually craft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the document that challenged the authority of Louis XVI and his absolute monarchy, and that called for citizenship and equality and brotherhood in the French nation. The end result was that the election of 1796 turned out in a way that nobody could predict it. In 1796, the 12th Amendment had not yet been adopted. So instead of people running on one ticket for both president and vice president, people basically ran as individuals. So basically, whoever captured the most votes, that person ended up winning the presidency, with the person capturing the second most votes ended up becoming the vice president. As a result of the backroom machinations of none other than Alexander Hamilton, the result ended up being that Federalist John Adams ended up winning the election of 1796. But his running mate, Thomas Pinckney, did not beat Jefferson in the number of votes gathered. So the end result was that while we didn't have officially have parties at this time, we had the individual that would really kind of end up being the first Federalist president, John Adams, winning the presidency and having as a vice president the future leader of the Democratic Republican Party. Now, the 1796 did carry some trepidation with it, as many people wondered, could the United States of America really engineer an election that would lead to a peaceful transfer of power? The end result was yes, they could. However, the next 4 years of the Adams administration would see two former best friends, Adams and Jefferson, starting to really move in polar opposite directions. Their relationship, in fact, soured to the point of near hatred during this administration, and would not be healed until both men left office. So 4 years later, during the election of 1800, this is when partisan politics really finally came into being in the United States of America. Party machines led by the Federalists on the one hand and Democratic Republicans on the other hand would run newspaper advertisements. Supporters would draw cartoons which would be circulated. There would basically be what we call mudflinging during the course of the election, and this only added to the further distancing of these two friends. So whereas the 1796 election was relatively peaceful, there was actually a fear in 1800 of potential civil war, as people started to discuss the mobilization of militias should one side try to basically steal the election from the other. Fortunately for the United States of America, these fears never materialized. Now, the Adams administration came into power with already some problems, if you will. The first was Adams' character. George Washington was somebody that Americans could get behind, somebody that they could really love, a charismatic figure, a hero of the American Revolution. Now, John Adams was no less crucial in the course of the American Revolutionary War, but he tended to be a little bit more stuffy than George Washington, a little bit more aloof. In addition to that, he did not have an overwhelming fondness for the American people. He once referred to them as the boorish masses. And he even generated some ridicule during the first session of Congress when the issue came before the Senate of how to address Washington. Adams actually suggested including language such as His Excellency, the President of the United States. From Adams' view, the idea was that the United States president should be considered an important person, and so some of the language that commonly was used to address the monarch should be adopted for the United States. This did not go over well with that first meeting in the Senate. He received quite a bit of backlash from his fellow politicians, and in the end they said, you know what, we'll just go with Mr. President. Now, Adams' administration would be characterized by a pro-British stance during the course of the French Revolution. Now, the United States had already found itself getting pulled into affairs against its wishes already. In 1793, the Citizen Genet affair occurred under the Washington administration when the French ambassador, an individual referred to as Citizen Genet, came to the United States of America. Now, Washington told him in no uncertain terms that the United States of America tended to be neutral in that conflict. But Citizen Genet believed that there was enough support of the French cause that he could go around and try to drum up recruits to the French war effort, leading to Washington's demand that the French government recall him. While the Adams administration did attempt to maintain this sense of neutrality, in the end it was not a possibility. The Adams administration ended up striking an agreement with the British government that reopened trade with some British West Indies colonies, as well as to Great Britain itself. The agreement also gave a British promise that they would curtail their efforts of impressing American sailors on the seas. Now, quick little note here. Impressment was a common tactic used by the British Navy. What they could do is they could go among British citizens, young men capable of naval service, and tell them, hey, you are basically being drafted into the British Navy right here and right now. You don't have a choice. Get on the boat. Let's go. Now, one thing that the British did not recognize was the naturalization process in the United States of America. So once born a British subject, you were always a British subject. So what the British would do is they would stop American merchant vessels, and in some cases, even American military naval vessels, go on board, round up anybody that they suspected of having British nationality, and then take them on board British vessels where they would serve in the British Navy. So Britain promised to curtail impressment, although they did not have any intention whatsoever of following through. The result was that France viewed this as a violation of the friendship that had been formed since their treaty of their alliance during the American Revolutionary War. And so the French government, under what was known as the Directorate, authorized French privateers to seize American merchantmen. John Adams, in response, likewise authorized American privateers to do the same thing. The end result was that from 1798 to 1800, America and France found themselves in a quasi-war. In other words, they were, for all practical purposes, in a state of war on the high seas, but the declaration of war had not been declared. Now, Jefferson did attempt to resolve the issue. He sent an ambassador to meet with Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who was a prominent figure within the French government. But what happened turned out to be a scandal known as the XYZ affair. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand refused to meet with the American legation, and instead sent 3 operatives to meet with them. What they did is they basically demanded a $250,000 bribe for Talleyrand himself, as well as a rather hefty loan to the French government. The American delegation promptly returned home, and then the papers that described the affair were leaked to the presses, causing outrage throughout the United States of America. Now, the Adams administration compounded its problems by passing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. John Adams was something of a thin-skinned individual, and he was getting quite a bit of bad press in Democratic Republican papers. He also viewed immigrants as a potential source of voters for the Democratic Republican Party, as they tended to vote with that party. So what the Alien Act did is it extended to 14 years the amount of time that immigrants had to wait before they could be naturalized. And if during that time they did anything to cast suspicion on themselves, they could promptly be deported. The Sedition Acts behind that basically made it illegal for you to speak out, especially in writing, against American officials. It actually carried with it fines and a jail sentence. And what happened after the passage of the Alien Sedition Acts is that there were cases brought before the courts. There were individuals jailed under the terms of the Sedition Act, but almost all of them, in fact, all of them, turned out to be editors of Democratic Republican papers. The response to the Alien Sedition Acts was rather swift in the forms of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. The Kentucky resolution was written by none other than Thomas Jefferson, and the Virginia resolution was authored by James Madison himself. James Madison had been growing increasingly suspicious of the course that the United States government was taking, starting with the Secretary of State or Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton's publications on manufacturers and National Bank and public credit. Madison believed that the central government was gaining way too much authority. The Alien and Sedition Acts were too much for him. What Jefferson and Madison claimed was that the United States of a government was a compact of sovereign states. And as sovereign states, they claimed the right to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, and thereby, through legislative means within their own borders, they could nullify an act of Congress. And this is rather interesting given the fact that James Madison himself was the principal architect of the central government. So it really kind of shows which direction Madison was starting to evolve. Now, ultimately, no other states signed on to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. It was considered too radical. Nonetheless, the the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions laid the framework for this concept of state sovereignty, of the right of nullification, and what also became known as interposition, especially throughout the southern states for the remainder of the next 60 decades. So, oftentimes, when you heard southern legislatures threatening to secede from the Union or threatening to not abide by federal law, the argument, the theoretical argument that they would always come back to was the idea of state sovereignty, the idea of a state's rights to nullify a congressional legislation. Even though, in the creation of the American Constitution, one of the first things that the framers did was change the preamble to the Constitution. Remember, the Articles of Confederation viewed the government as a compact of sovereign states. This language was dropped from the U.S. Constitution because they wanted to make the point that under this new government, it was one government. It was one federal government formed by the people. So this idea of state nullification was created here and would haunt the United States of America up until it was finally resolved with the American Civil War. Now, following the election of Thomas Jefferson, there were some more developments in the U.S. government. The first was the creation of the spoils system. Now, under Jefferson, the spoils system really did not come into full-fledged being, but you can see the early seeds being planted. So, in modern American government, there are some offices that incoming administrations have the right to appoint people to, and they can basically demand that the office holders that were there with the earlier administration resign and make room. But in the late 1800s, what had happened is there were a series of civil reform laws passed that basically made it illegal for administrations to try to do this. You couldn't just simply, populate the entire federal government with your friends and your cronies. That was, considered cronyism. That was considered nepotism. But we do see the beginnings of this with the Jefferson administration. Coming into office, what he did is he replaced 25% of federal office holders with members of the Democratic Republican government. Now, keep in mind that Thomas Jefferson advocated this idea of a limited federal government, that, only those things that should be expressly stated in the Constitution were allowed to take, were allowed to be conducted by the federal government. But one thing about Thomas Jefferson is that he actually did some things that were, really more Hamiltonian by nature, and none other than this than the purchase of the Louisiana territory in 1803. The French Revolution by 1803 was going poorly for Napoleon overseas. He wanted to basically come back down here into the Caribbean and reestablish French control over Haiti, which was roughly right here on this map. It's a little bit kind of hidden by the map key. The idea was conquer the slave rebellion that had begun in 1791 and reestablish this as basically a French base for further expansion. So from Haiti, what the French would then do is they would go on to New Orleans, which the French government had reclaimed from Spain with the Treaty of San Ildefonso. And then this would serve as the next key point in further French expansion throughout the interior of the continent, thus, resurrecting French dreams of a continental empire in North America. He even sent about 30,000 troops to Haiti in order to snuff out the fledgling government created under the former slave turned military hero and political leader Toussaint Louverture. The end result was rather grim for the French and very good for the Haitian population. On the one hand, Toussaint Louverture proved a very capable field commander that couldn't be pinned down in a decisive battle. And in addition to that, the French soldiers suffered heavy casualties from yellow fever. The end was that Napoleon decided enough was enough with the Western Hemisphere. In his famous statement, he declared, damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies, and ordered his agents to sell not just New Orleans, which is all the Jefferson administration was really after at first, but the entirety of Louisiana Purchase to the American government, in all at a steal, at a bargain basement price of $15 to $16 million. So even though the Constitution didn't say he could do it, he did it. The end result was he more than doubled the size of the United States of America. Now, while Jefferson also, opined against cities and their corrupting nature on a Republican society, his administration ended up kind of pushing New England in the direction of industrialization. Keep in mind, there was already this desire there, but there was a lot of competition with Great Britain in terms of industry and manufacturing and markets. So Jefferson, like Washington, like Adams, had this great struggle that his administration was going through. The United States of America, since the founding of the country, had advocated a policy known as neutrality of the high seas. This is that's a bad looking F. This is the idea that during times of war, neutral vessels would be considered non-belligerents, and as such, they would be allowed to trade with warring powers. The British and the French, however, refused to acknowledge this policy. In fact, it would take World War I before the United States of America, under the Wilson administration, finally achieved this in the Versailles Conference. The first test of the Adams and Jefferson administration actually wasn't against the British and the French. It was against what were known as the Barbary states of Tripoli, of Algiers, basically modern-day Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia. These were individual potentates, or basically kind of self-governing regions within the larger Ottoman Empire. And they had long since had a practice of piracy throughout the Mediterranean Ocean. They preyed on British, French, Spanish, Italian, all sorts of European shipping in this region. They would go on board, they would take the people captive, sell them as slaves in the Ottoman Empire, take the goods as their own property as well as the ships. And so what the United States of America had a habit of doing, or a policy of doing, was basically trying to pay these guys off. We'll give you hundreds of thousands of dollars every year if you just leave our ships alone, because the Jefferson administration and Congress as a whole refused to invest in a U.S. Navy that could basically protect its shipping, even though the United States of America had one of the largest, if not the largest merchant fleet on the high seas. So after the seizure of an American warship, Jefferson sent to Tripoli another ship that would attempt to rescue the sailors that had been taken into slavery. While there were some successes in the campaign, they proved to be rather negligible. But they did end up securing the captured crew. But basically, the United States would have to go back to relying on payments to keep the pirates away from them. The next major test was a series of incidents with the British and the French, especially the British. By 1807, Napoleon's navy was basically marginalized after a disastrous naval battle at Trafalgar, in which Lord Nelson just decimated the French fleet. So from that point on, this was 1805, the French fleet was really limited to some action on the high seas, but mostly coastal activities and privateering. So it was really the British at this point. And in 1807, the British actually did this daring act. One of their warships, the USS Leopard, stopped an American naval vessel by the name of the USS Chesapeake. They boarded it, and in the process of boarding it, they actually opened fire on the Chesapeake, killing at least three sailors. And they took some of the other sailors and pressed them into the British Royal Navy and then sailed off. And this caused an absolute outcry for conflict throughout the United States. So what Jefferson decided was, instead of going to war with Great Britain, he was just simply going to stop trading. He was going to make another attempt at basically what happened under the non-importation agreement prior to the American Revolutionary War. They were just going to boycott everything from Europe. So he said, okay, nobody can leave port unless you are, engaged in what was known as coastal trading, which is basically trading, with other American ports of call, or some limited West Indies trade. End result was the economy tanked under this policy. There were still some merchants that made off good because they basically just risked it. They said, forget about it. We're going to send our ships and bet that since there isn't much of a navy anyhow, the United States government will never find out. And then on top of that, we're just going to risk our vessels getting captured on the high seas. After all, they had insurance. In their view, the sailors knew what they were getting involved in. So if they were caught, they were caught. In the end, the merchants themselves would end up making out well. So the Embargo Act really kind of tanked agricultural prices. The shipping industry generally suffered, as well as merchants. And this is what really kind of led merchants to saying, okay, it's time for us to start industrializing here. We need to start being able to make these goods and services on our own. So in the end, it's really the Embargo Act of 1807 that would kind of push New England into that path of industrialization. Now, the Supreme Court also materialized in the early Republic under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall. A series of key Supreme Court rulings. John Marshall created, the Supreme Court that the United States has today. It started with Marbury versus Madison, when he declared that the Supreme Court had the right of judicial review. And in other words, the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court alone could determine whether or not a federal law was unconstitutional. The next major case, and there were many cases that Marshall oversaw here, but the next major case was McCulloch versus Maryland, which involved the foundation of a National Bank of the United States. When it was created, a lot of people believed that this was unconstitutional, that it wasn't spelled out. But what McCulloch versus Maryland said was that, the necessary proper clause did give Congress, leeway to create this bank. It's not explicitly spelled out, but it does meet the definition of an institution that promotes the general welfare of the nation. As such, this idea of supporting a loose interpretation of the Constitution was founded within McCulloch versus Maryland. This was later extended in Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824, where the federal government, its right to regulate interstate commerce, was formally recognized. And then onwards in Native American affairs, there were two absolutely pivotal rulings that still underlie Native American rights in the United States today. There was Cherokee versus Nation versus Georgia in 1831. And what Marshall declared then was that Native Americans were considered domestic dependent nations. Even though they existed within the borders of the United States of America, they retained much of their sovereignty that they enjoyed prior to being engulfed within American borders. And that included their rights to their land. The following year, when Georgia again tried to challenge this by passing laws and or trying to arrest people on Native American reservations, Marshall came back and he said, hey, states, you have no authority on Native American reservations, even though they are within your borders. That is purely within the realm of the federal government. And so even today, these are two key Supreme Court rulings in terms of Native American rights. Now, during the early Republic, American society was also evolving. There was this new concept that had been created as a result of the French Revolution, the idea of a nation and a nation state. Today, geographers recognize that nations are groups of people that tend to share a common language. They have a common history. They share usually a common ethnicity. And they have a traditional homeland. So there's a key region that they are viewed as coming from, historically. So the Kurds of the Middle East definitely fit this. You can apply this to the French, most of whom, descended from the ancient Gauls in the area that France now exists in. They have that language, they have that history. And many people were attempting to create what were known as nation states. So nations with recognized state borders. Now, the problem is that most countries today do not fit the definition of a nation. Great Britain doesn't really fit it. Why? Because it is comprised of Wales, Britain, Scotland, and parts of Ireland. Those are all different nations. The United States of America does not fit it. Why? There wasn't really one American language. There is a history, but it only goes back to colonialism. Ethnicity, you have people from Africa, people that are native to the Americas, people from Europe, people from everywhere. And then in terms of homeland, Americans as we know them today didn't come from America. Those are Native Americans. They came from elsewhere. But there's still this impulse of creating a nation and a nation state. And this is where Benedict Anderson's concept of an imagined community comes in. So in the aftermath of the United States of America, one thing that they tried to do was to really kind of create this idea of an American ethnicity. So you would have books by individuals like Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, Letters of an American Farmer, Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. Sometimes foreigners coming through the United States, and they would start talking about an American character as described as individualistic, Republican in nature, hard-working, constantly in motion, very mobile, moving from place to place. There was the attempt also in creating this ethnicity of creating a national art form. And the first evolution of this was the Hudson River School, a series of painters that focused on the American landscape that was oftentimes idealized as, really kind of speaking to the character of America. In fact, a lot of people today argue over, environmentalism, conservationism, preservation, all that stuff. But the reality is Americans have been in love with the land ever since colonial times. It's always been, a characteristic of it. That's one of the reasons why we don't really, we have national monuments, that's true, but a lot of times our national monuments are our national parks. They're Yosemite, it's Denali, it's portions that just kind of speak to America, the physical environment. There were, of course, also a series of of authors coming up and writing books, and instead of trying to place them in Europe, where do these books take place? These stories, well, it's in America. James Fenimore Cooper with Last of the Mohicans, the Natty Bumppo series. You had Washington Irving, whom most people as kids still during Halloween hear the story of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And then there was another type of literature that was started by Parson Weems and continued on in the 1800s, this idea of telling stories about the quintessential great American man. So a story that almost all Americans that know is the story of George Washington chops down the cherry tree. His father confronts him and he says, "Oh, Father, I cannot tell a lie." Parson Weems made that up. It was a story for kids. And then finally, in terms of language, this has been something that Americans have been dealing with ever since founding of the nation. Noah Webster published his American Spelling Book before the Constitution was even written. And this is, of course, American language. Of course, we speak English, though. But we speak the American English language. And so some of the things that changed in English based on Webster were Native American terms that had been adopted, terms like, say, tomahawk. There were terms that Americans had borrowed from their German immigrants, or their Scottish immigrants, or their French immigrants, or even African slaves and free blacks. And then, of course, Jedediah Morris, he published the very first geographical study in 1789 and did some other studies for the federal government to just, find out, what is America? Where is it? What kind of landscapes does it consist of? Now, at the same time that they're trying to create this nation state, America itself is also going through some changes. One of the most profound ones of this time period, though, was the Second Great Awakening. This was the time period in which we saw new denominations emerge, such as the American Baptists. Another group of Christians that would emerge from the Second Great Awakening was the Church of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormon Church. All kind of having their own brand of Christianity that centered around evangelicalism. This idea of going out and preaching the word, one that was very staunchly Protestant and tended to appeal more emotionally than the older, more methodical or traditional, more kind of cerebral or ritualistic churches, such as the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Methodist Church. So here's a great example of a revival sermon. Usually happen outdoors. People falling into trances. Very charismatic preacher leading it. And there were hot spots of this movement, such as the Burned Over District in New York, but we'll talk more about that when we get to the Mormons in another lecture. But the key of the Great Awakening was that while religious in nature, it actually ended up fusing with other movements in the United States of America, including movements such as the women's rights movement, as well as the abolitionist and anti-slavery movements. So an example of this, there was a leading, he was a Congregationalist, but then he changed his denomination, but a leading minister of the Second Great Awakening, a guy by the name of Theodore Dwight Weld. And he ended up marrying the daughter of another famous minister. And this guy's name was none other than Charles Grandison Finney. Her name was Angelina Grimke. And she took the last name Weld when she married, as women did back then. And she had a sister by the name of Sarah Grimke. And Sarah, by the way, later on went on to convert to Quakerism. But anytime you talk abolitionism, you have to talk Sarah Grimke, and you have to talk about Angelina Grimke Weld, because they were two of the biggest voices in abolitionism. But not just simply in abolitionism, which they viewed as highly immoral, but their actions in abolitionism also proved to them that women should have the right to vote and speak in public, and more, more social, more political, more economic rights. And so they ended up getting tied into the women's revolution. And so later on, these are going to be two figures that are crucial in the path that eventually leads to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention in New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and other feminists introduced the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically was a women's declaration of independence. I mean, they even used the exact same language for it. Now, the American economy was also growing and changing and evolving in this time period. First off, in the North, composite farms started, really becoming the major form. So there's always been this, debate, were farmers subsistence farmers, or were they, market farmers? And this concept says, well, they were a little bit of both, primarily subsistence. They grew enough for their family, but they always wanted, were always looking out for new markets and ways to improve their crops so they could sell those and improve their station. And then, of course, down there in the South, southern plantations were growing. Keep in mind, southern plantations and their slave labor, there was a lot of question over whether or not it continued, whether or not it would be economically viable. But in 1794, Eli Whitney, this New England tutor that was teaching children down on a southern plantation, he found a machine known as a cotton gin, and he improved on it, and then he patented the cotton gin in 1794. Now, the cotton gin itself did not suddenly make slavery viable. No. This later fused with the Industrial Revolution that took off in Great Britain in the early 1800s, and it centered around textile mills. And this, as well as the opening of mills, similar textile mills in New England, then that is what made slavery all of a sudden viable again. And all of a sudden you started hearing Southerners proclaiming to the four corners of the world that cotton is king. And the multiplication of cotton plantations following that. Now, in New England, there was another development. There was a man by the name of Francis Cabot Lowell. He was very good with machines, and he had actually spent 1812 to 1813 in England, and he studied a lot of the machines that were being used in textile mills at that time. There was also another individual that was very gifted in mechanics that had a similar experience, known as Richard Slater. Francis Cabot Lowell had the connections, and so he was able to form connections not only with Slater, but with also with other prominent New England industrial investors, and they formed the Boston Manufacturing Company. And in New England, they followed the very British model of creating these rather large industrial complexes. these mills. And in these mills, you had your spinning Jennings and your flying shuttles and all this stuff. They were initially powered by water, but later on, with the advent of coal, they would switch machine or energy sources. But initially, these were located in places with easy access to water power, streams. And in these factories, they oftentimes had boarding houses, if not right there on the premises, well, at least somewhere close by. And what he did is he went and he found young ladies from the surrounding countryside and said, hey, look, you can come to my mill. I'm going to pay you a wage, part of which will go back home to your family. You can save up the rest of it. Now, you have to stay in the boarding houses. There are rules you have to abide by. You gotta you can't go out just dating whoever. You have to be chaperoned in public. You have to attend lectures. You have to be at work at a certain time. You have to be in bed at a certain time. And so basically the, patriarchal figure of the father on the farm was replaced by the mill owner in these mills. But a lot of young ladies flocked to the mills. And interesting enough, even though they had all these constraints on them, it later kind of opened up the avenue for further women's movements when attempts to unilaterally lower the wages that they were earning led to a series of strikes in these mills. So basically what was happening in the early republic is that they were becoming firmly ensconced in the Atlantic trade, and not just the Atlantic trade. Through some of their agreements with Great Britain, they had gained access to some of the harbors in India, and they were also attempting to extend their trade with China. In fact, John Jacob Astor led a lot of these efforts to open up trade with China. And so China is not just now hitting our radar in terms of trade and relations. It's been there ever since the founding of the Republic. Now again, foreign affairs were a big issue during the early Republic. The French Revolution dominated a lot of attention, people for it, people against it. And this was no different than in Great Britain. You had Jacobin clubs throughout Great Britain that supported it, people that were repulsed by the terror that streaked through France and the wars of conquest. But the key thing was that American neutrality was always at the forefront of American affairs, as was stopping impressment and securing American neutrality on the high seas. Now, other areas of foreign affairs dealt mostly with Great Britain. As part of the Treaty of Paris, the British had promised to remove forts that it held in the Great Lakes region, but they never did. In addition to that, there was the issue of impressment on the high seas. And these were just two key problems that the Americans had with the British. Of course, the British had problems with the Americans. Americans never returned the property of loyalists, still had outstanding debts as well. So in 1794, under George Washington, there was an attempt to resolve all these issues with when he sent John Jay, future Supreme Court Justice, to negotiate a settlement. And the result was Jay's Treaty. And what ended up happening is the United States promised to pay outstanding debts, and were actually pretty well, kind of locked into doing that. So Britain got one of its serious demands. And then all Britain did is it said, okay, by 1796, we'll start removing our troops from this area, and we'll quit sending weapons and other supplies to Native Americans here, supporting their resistance to the United States government, and we'll quit trading with them. And trade was real big because the United States viewed these natives as within American land, and therefore that trade was supposed to be their trade. But Jay's Treaty was considered such an affront to American dignity that Washington and Congress actually kept it quiet or tried to keep it absolutely quiet from the public, but it ended up getting leaked to the public, and that was one of the areas of criticism that was leveled at George Washington. Then there was Pinckney's Treaty. This was actually very successful. One of the keys to American settlement in the West was this right here, the Mississippi River. Because the Ohio River, but also the Tennessee River, all these rivers connected to it. And then over here, you had the Appalachian, let me not do a squiggle right there. Let me switch this. You had the Appalachian Mountains, and this was a really big obstacle. I mean, this basically made trade almost prohibitive in terms of cost in shipping it to the East Coast to be sent to market. So any sort of trade for these interior states had to go down through here. There were also some other areas where, like, rivers here in Georgia flowed through Florida. So basically what they needed was a guarantee that these rivers would be open to American commerce to make this region viable, but also this region viable. And one of the keys here was, of course, the port of New Orleans. And so what Pinckney's Treaty did is it actually secured from the Spanish the right for Americans to load and unload in New Orleans and to trade there. It gave them some navigational rights to the Mississippi, but limited. And, of course, it gave the southern states a right to navigate the rivers that flowed through Florida. But one thing it didn't do is, in Florida, this remained a hotbed. Not only Native American tribes fleeing southern states, but also African Americans tended to take up residence in Florida. In fact, there was a band of Native Americans known as the Seminoles who took in members of other tribes as well as these fugitive slaves actually adopted them. And they became very powerful throughout central Florida, and they oftentimes led or at least supported attacks into southern Georgia. So the Americans, the United States, one of the reasons why they really wanted Florida was for navigation, but also to clamp down on this activity. But they didn't secure it in Pinckney's Treaty. Now, for Western lands, there were a number of series of events that happened. First off, there was resistance to the United States of America to the United States of America by Native Americans living in the Ohio River Valley. And initially, it was led by Little Turtle, a Miami leader. And Little Turtle was a very successful, very capable military figure. He actually managed to conquer not one, but two expeditionary forces sent against him. The first one was led by a General Josiah Harmer in 1790 under Washington. His forces were absolutely smashed by Little Turtle. It was an embarrassing defeat. The second one was led by General Arthur St. Clair in 1791. And what Arthur St. Clair decided to do was, instead of just trying to straight up invade the area, he would establish a fort, and then he would move on, establish a fort, and then move on, establish a fort. And these forts would secure a good supply line and protection. But ultimately, St. Clair was defeated as well. Finally, Washington turned to a guy by the name of Anthony Wayne, whose nickname was General Mad Anthony Wayne. And Mad Anthony Wayne adopted St. Clair's approach of establishing forts, but he was a much more capable leader. And then what ended up happening is he engaged Little Turtle's troops near modern-day Maumee, Ohio in 1795 at a place known as Fallen Timbers. And this was actually really close to a British fort that had been supplying Little Turtle. And it was an incredibly one-sided defeat of the Miami, and they viewed it really as a betrayal of the British. But one of the important things of Fallen Timbers is there was actually a very young Native American warrior there by the name of Tecumseh. and he himself was angered over the conflict. But what angered him more was the treaty that Little Turtle was forced to sign afterwards. And what the treaty did is, part of my map's not here, Ohio, Michigan, like all of this territory was ceded to the United States of America, even part of modern day Indiana. In the Treaty of Greenville, they actually ceded territory that they didn't even own. Now, another major development in Western lands was the Corps of Discovery. This was the expedition that was led by William Clark and Meriwether Lewis from 1804 to 1806. So after Jefferson purchased the land, he outfitted this group, and they had a number of different goals. So they started right here in St. Louis. Goal number one, of course, was to wind their way up along the Mississippi River into the Missouri River, from the Missouri River over to the Yellowstone. And here you can see that they kind of broke off from one another. Eventually, they reconnected along the Snake and wound their way up here. And they were to make their way all the way over to the Pacific Ocean and see if there was a passage to the Pacific Ocean, a water passage. In addition to this, though, they had another goal, and that was scientific observation. After all, Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment, so he wanted to know what kind of flora and fauna were out there. And he had all sorts of questionnaires that these guys were to fill out, and they were to take samples. But not only that, but the group was also to engage in Native American relations. And so to that end, he actually sent them with, like a flatboat just piled with trade goods. And so they ended up connecting with the Arikara and the Mandan along the Missouri. They connected with the Siouan peoples, learned about some of the interior, but the tribes in this area. They engaged with the Nez Perce. They engaged over here with many of the tribes that existed in the northwestern region, took observations. Some of the relations went well. The attempting to establish relations like with the Lakota, though, did not go very well at all. And then as they came back, the idea was to establish the United States of America as a key source of trade with the Native Americans. One thing about the Louisiana Purchase for Thomas Jefferson is that he envisioned all of this territory not necessarily becoming states anytime soon. To him, all of this territory was actually going to become known as Indian country. So the idea was that the United States of America, through treaty relations, would actually remove all Native Americans to this territory. And according to Jefferson, this would remove them from the influence of settlers, American settlers. And in this area, they could either thrive in their traditional ways, or preferable to Jefferson, they would adopt American culture. Now, today we recognize the forceful removal of an entire people based on their culture and their language and other factors as genocide, but in this time period, that concept hadn't really evolved, especially as a legal term yet. But this was essentially what Jefferson was aiming for. Now, the final major development that occurred in the early Republic with Native Americans was relations with the Shawnee people. So the Shawnee Confederacy, when we look at the Great Lakes area, what we have to understand about them is that it wasn't just one people. It was actually a multitude of people that oftentimes went through a process known as ethnogenesis. So ethnogenesis is what happens when people suffer from, what happened when Native Americans tended to suffer from heavy casualties from conflict, loss of land, um, disease. And what ended up happening is you would have like a process whereby, this tribe up here, having been severely reduced, would relocate. And then maybe you had another tribe over here and they would relocate. And then you'd have yet another tribe going through the same process, and they all relocate maybe into the territory of the tribe that was there in the beginning, this one. And the end result was the fusion of all of these cultures into one new culture. And so some of the Native American tribes that we associate with the Great Lakes region, they were a process of this. And the Shawnee, they absorbed other tribes, as a result of conflict and disease and loss of land. Now, Tecumseh, keep in mind, he was this young man that had been at Fallen Timbers, and he was embittered. He was angry about what had happened at Timbers. He was angry at the Treaty of Grenville. And one thing that he determined was that he was not going to lose any more land. And so what he did is he established a confederacy with the Shawnee that went all the way down as far south as the Creek in modern-day Georgia, in Alabama. And as he was doing this, he had a half-brother by the name of Tenskwatawa, who was going through a kind of a native revitalization movement. And the idea was to restore native culture, get rid of, the education, the tools, and the other things that they had been adopting from the Americans. And he gained a rather large following at a settlement known as Prophetstown. Now, while he was doing this, you had a new governor of Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, up and comer on the political scene. And he wanted to not only break the Confederacy apart because it was a source of resistance, but he wanted to get Tecumseh and these other tribes to continue ceding land. So the result was continued resistance by Tecumseh, saying, no, 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 William Henry Harrison getting more and more aggressive. And the end result was that these two sides met at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. The Battle of Tippecanoe featured Tenskwatawa versus William Henry Harrison. And the result was really one-sided, with William Henry Harrison's forces winning. One of the things about Tenskwatawa is he believed in the power of ritual, and he actually promised his soldiers, look, if you follow the path, if you believe, then we'll be able to go into battle and we'll overcome, and we'll be able to just move through their bullets and everything will turn out all right. And unfortunately it didn't for them, and they lost rather heavily, and Prophetstown was destroyed. Now, the final major event that occurred in the early republic was the War of 1812. Following Jefferson, James Madison came to power. He was elected president. He was Democratic Republican. And when he came into power, he still had to deal with all the old problems: not necessarily the French Revolution, impressment, British, Native American, all these same challenges. And one thing that had developed by the time he came to power were a group of congressmen known as war hawks. They were pro-war against not only the Native Americans, but against the French. So what they wanted to do was to not only guarantee freedom of the seas out here, but for their other war aims, they included, conquering the Shawnee Confederacy, as well as those that allied with them in the South. And they believed that the time was right to invade and take over Canada. They believed they'd be able to march in there quickly, defeat the Canadians, and the Canadians would be them as liberators. Pretty much none of this proved successful. Right off the bat, the Americans found themselves in a lot of trouble. First problem was they relied on militias. They were still suspicious of standing armies, and so you could, get a militia full of Virginians, but then the Virginians said, "Well, we're not going to Pennsylvania because we weren't, signing up for that. We were signing up to fight in Virginia." And likewise, the Pennsylvanians would say, "Well, we're not going to go up into New York. It's not our fight. We're here to fight for Pennsylvania." So localism came back to bite them. In addition to that, their weapons, their arms, their armaments, nowhere near the same quality as the British. So that similar problem left over from the Revolution. They didn't have an army, a navy really to speak about. They had a few warships, such as the USS Constitution, and a bunch of gunboats. Now, in the War of 1812, there would be one bright area, and that would be the USS Constitution. Some of their ships, did some remarkable things on the high seas. But army made up mostly of militia that was led by guys that hadn't seen action since the American Revolutionary War with substandard equipment, spelled doom, and that's exactly what happened. Up here in Canada, it was largely defeat after defeat after defeat for the Americans. In fact, out here in this area, the United States of America lost three major forts: Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and Fort Meigs, without even firing a shot. And then there was one bright spot though. In 1813, there was a battle on the Thames River, so it's up in this little neck of land right here. In that battle, pitted William Henry Harrison against General Proctor, that was leading the British and Canadians, as well as the Shawnee fighters. And in the course, not only was Proctor defeated, but Proctor quickly retreated, leaving the Shawnee behind, and Tecumseh was killed in the course of the fighting. So that was one American victory. But then the war continued to go badly for the Americans, starting with their invasion of Canada and the burning of York. So there's a lot of fighting here, and in one of the cases they burned, just literally torched a Canadian city. And this happened right at the same time that Napoleon got whipped in Russia, and at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon was pretty much over with. So what that meant was that now you had British troops arriving en masse in Canada and in the United States of America. And in payment for what the Americans did at York, you had two British leaders. One was General Robert Ross, the other was Rear Admiral George Cockburn. And they sailed right up the Chesapeake, made a beeline for Washington, D.C., and they torched it in September of 1814. In fact, it was rather embarrassing for the Americans. The Army, the Congress, even the President himself just fled from the Capitol. Luckily, Dolly Madison stayed behind. She's the reason why we still have that unfinished portrait of George Washington and our original Declaration of Independence. She actually got those documents. But they torched it. They torched the Congress building, which is why today, if you want to do research on the early republic, you won't find any of the proceedings up to about 1815, 1816, because that went up in flames. They went to the Executive Mansion, what they called the Executive Mansion, the President's house. Ross and his troops actually got there right after Madison had fled, and dinner was on the table, still hot. I mean, they literally put their feet up, ate the president's food, and then they torched his house, which was later rebuilt and painted white, hence the reason why we call it the White House. But there was one glimmer of hope in these campaigns, and that was at Fort McHenry. And it was at Fort McHenry that the ancestor of a Civil War leader named George Armistead, his ancestor actually defended Fort McHenry, and George Armistead, ironically, his ancestor fought for the continued survival of the Republic, and then Armistead died in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, fighting for the Confederacy and the dissolution of the Union. It's kind of an interesting fact there. But at Fort McHenry, the fort held out against the superior force. And offshore, there was actually a lawyer that had been taken prisoner by the. Well, he hadn't been taken prisoner. He was there trying to advocate for a doctor's release who had been captured by the British and charged of espionage. And the man's name was Francis Scott Key, the lawyer, that is. The lawyer's name was Francis Scott Key. And as he sat there watching this massive bombardment and this fighting at Fort McHenry, he sat down to compose a poem that goes, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose bright stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight over the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave?" You know, he's penning this while the battle's going on, wondering what the outcome would be. But this later on, this Star-Spangled Banner was then later on attached to a really popular tavern drinking song at the time. It was like a really good, catchy tune that people, patrons just loved, And from that was born the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. It's also believed at Fort Henry, for the first time, the true American flag with the 13 stripes, it was a new design, flew over the fort with the stars inlaid. Until that, there were a lot of versions of the flag that had gone through. You had Martha Washington's original one with the circle, and then some other evolutions that included, believe it or not, the Union Jack. There was actually one version where they kept the British Union Jack up here in the corner, but the one with the stars and bars actually flew. So a lot of the symbols of the United States government that we know today were born in this conflict. Now, finally, there was another area where the Americans did well. So, they fared some good victories here. You had Oliver Hazard Perry out here on the Great Lakes that did well, the USS Constitution out here. And then down here, you had a Tennessee militia general by the name of Andrew Jackson. He had been dispatched by Washington to go and support the southern states. There was a group of Creek natives, a band within them known as the Baton Rouge or the Red Sticks, that refused to go with the more pro-American branch of the Creek Nation and make peace with the Americans. And they had been waging war against the United States in the South. And at one particular site, it was the Battle of Fort Mims in 1814. The Red Sticks broke through the American defenses and slaughtered, they killed men, women, children, soldiers, pretty much left no one alive. So what Jackson did is, he cornered the Creeks at a village known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And in this battle that took place on January 8th, 1815, the way that it was is they called it Horseshoe Bend because it literally made a horseshoe type bend, an oxbow as we call it. And so you had the Native Americans, they had palisades that were defending, this part of it, but then they had all this water to their rear. And Jackson and his men, that include a very young Sam Houston and David Crockett, stormed the ramparts. Sam Houston was even wounded during the course of the fighting, and they killed everybody in the village. And it was payback for Mims. But Jackson made his name, and he actually developed his approach to negotiating with Native Americans. Threaten them with conflict if they didn't budge, then go down there and just outright, unleash the full might of the U.S. military, and then afterwards get them to cede all their land. That's essentially what they did with the Red Sticks there. But after that, he then proceeded on down through parts of Spanish Spanish Florida. So here, he continues on to Spanish Florida. And then from there, he marched overland to New Orleans, where he basically faced a British fleet of regulars that had actually fought with Lord Wellington against Napoleon at places like the Battle of the Nations. And even though they were outnumbered, Andrew Jackson managed to rally everybody in the town. French Creole, Spanish Creole, slaves, freedmen and women. He even got a band of pirates to help Pierre Lafitte to help protect the waterway, because the way that New Orleans was is the battlefield was split. Here's New Orleans and the American line. There was a canal known as Rodriguez Canal right here. Then you had the Mississippi. And the way Pakenham attacked is he basically sent the bulk of his troops here, feigning motion in the swamp here. And he was going to send up another group here to take over the American artillery and then enfilade fire on the American lines. But yeah, he got so he had Lafitte like out here, like protecting the swamp, and some of his other pirates over here, and he even got like the prostitutes and some of the local brothels to go out there and reload guns and deal with the wounded. But ended up being a very one-sided victory for Jackson, one of the few victories for the United States of America. But unfortunately for Pakenham, who died, as well as all the other soldiers who died in the fighting, the war had actually ended about a week or two earlier. It's just it took a long time for news to reach the United States of America. But this ended the War of 1812, the Treaty of Ghent, and the Treaty of Ghent basically just said, okay, we're going to do a status quo here. No one's losing territory, no one's gaining territory. But the one thing that did happen is that this was it for the British. They said, okay, no more. We're just not really going to harass the Americans anymore. Impressment, fell off the map. They started negotiating with the Americans as, more or less equals, instead of just ignoring them outright. Canada, the United States hasn't even threatened to invade Canada since then. I mean, except for the occasional presidential election where one side or the other, both sides always do it. I'm going to run to Canada if we lose. But, aside from that, we've pretty much left Canada well alone. And yeah, I mean, for American nationhood, I mean, it's one of the more forgotten wars, but, really a lot of the symbols of the American state were developed in this time. So after that, we entered into a period known as the Era of Good Feelings, and it was called this, first of all, because partisan politics was believed to disappear. In 1814, the Federalist Party, members of it, met at the Hartford Convention, and they decided they'd had enough with, because I mean, up to this point, if you go back to the elections, sectionalism was already appearing. These guys continuously voted Democratic, Republican. These guys continuously voted Federalist. So these guys up here, they were tired of the 3/5 compromise that gave the southern states additional voting power. They were tired of annexing all these new states like Kentucky and Tennessee that just added to the power of the slaveholders in office. And they even, toyed with the idea of, straight up seceding from the nation and forming a separate peace with the British, and just having and just being done with the southern states altogether. So the United States, they didn't win the war, but since it ended on a high note at New Orleans, the Democratic Republicans could claim victory. So that was a really big black eye for the Federalists. And following that, they weren't able to really recover. And so the Era of Good Feelings, it's called such because it's really after that part, the period of Democratic Republican rule and the belief that partisan politics ended. It's also called the Era of Good Feelings because there were a lot of really important gains in this time. During the era of good feelings, the Erie Canal connected Lake Erie with New York, and it started this canal boom that would just make New York City the truly empire state. There was one brief moment, though, that threatened the stability of the nation, in fact, the unity of the nation, and that was when going into 1820, Missouri stood poised for admission to the State of Union, as did Maine. And you had enough slaveholders that had, started to move in this direction, especially considering the fact that cotton suddenly made slave labor viable again. So the slave states viewed all this territory as, vital to expanding their product, but also to preserving their union. Keep in mind, abolitionism and anti-slavery is alive and well at this time. We're getting into the time period where Congress in 1835 is going to pass a gag rule that basically censored any abolitionist and anti-slavery petitions from even being considered on the House of Representatives floor. So things are getting heated. And then you had the Northwest Ordinance that basically said, okay, all of this territory right here is going to be free territory, no slavery permitted. So with the with the Louisiana Territory, the fear was that all of this could end up being free territory. So the fear over disunion caused so much anger and so much fear of of a civil war that Thomas Jefferson himself described it as, being like a fire bell sounding in the night. But fortunately, you had an individual by the name of Henry Clay that would make his name starting in the era of good feelings. And he engineered what becomes known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And what it established is, Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri comes in as a slave state. And then what they did is they said, okay, there's this line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes. No slavery north of this line. And the idea was that would allow enough slave states here in the South that it would continue slavery and continue to protect it. But, as Americans later learned, that this only proved to be a temporary solution, just a Band-Aid for the issue. So in conclusion, this is an important period. You get a lot of Hollywood videos over the Civil War, over multiple Indian wars, over the American Revolutionary War. I cannot think of a film about the War of 1812. There are a lot of movies about the antebellum period, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in the South. But how many movies are there about the Lowell Mills? How many movies about the building of the Erie Canal? Lewis and Clark on their way to the western coast. Vital period, formative in U.S. history. It's really was a time when we navigated the perils of transfers of power, created an industrial base, an economic base, made it through the French Revolution, the War of 1812. And entered into what people believed was a post-partisan society, but the reality was that it wouldn't last. And not long after this era ends, the United States found itself once again facing the same old issues. How do you create a country? What kind of economy will it have? Will women be a full part of it? And more importantly, what will happen with slavery?